So thank you again for being on this show today. I have to tell you, I am thrilled. I can't tell you, I was thrilled when I picked up your book, as I mentioned during the intro. I just knew it was so synchronistic that I had to call you or reach out to you and get you on the show to talk about it because I was just blown away by it, and also by the synchronistic way I found the book. But once I read it, a couple of things emerged that I think are really relevant to leadership development and, some of the listeners today. So first, I just wanted to ask you, talk a little bit about you, like what you do, and also how did you come to write this book, The Spellbound?
I'm a psychiatrist. I became interested in the human mind during my undergraduate work at a very special school called St. John's College. St. John's has no lectures, no textbooks, and no tests.
Oh, really? I
Uh,
didn't hear that. Yeah, I'm familiar with St. John's, but I didn't realize that. Yeah.
yeah, we read the great books of Western civilization, starting from the ancient Greeks, Homer, Socrates, Plato, all the way up to the present. And
Wow.
we read these original sources and we just sit around in a group and talk about them. And so we got exposed to a lot of history, science, tons of philosophy, literature, and it just excited me so much that I began to think, the most important things in this world are the products of the human mind. And that's what I want to study. And so I decided to go to medical school to become a psychiatrist because so much of the fascinating work was being done on a biological level. But I was still fascinated by the psychology of it. And one of the things I noticed in my practice was that there is such a reliance on rationality and logic. And there's a reason for that. They're incredibly powerful tools. It's one of the things that makes us human, sets us aside from the other animals. And the more we develop technology, the more useful this rationality becomes. But it's only half of the picture. And if you spend all your time focusing on developing your rationality, you're going to become an unbalanced, partial person. There's a whole nother aspect to humanity, an aspect we see in stories about the supernatural, music, art, literature, drama. These are not rational things, but they're incredibly important to our humanity, and they're important to our success and living a fulfilling life. So I decided that I wanted to write about it in the hopes that people would appreciate this aspect of their humanity more.
So I know this is like a daunting task, but can you give us like a little primer, just from your sense and studies and all your expertise on the human mind and some of the things, these parts of the mind that you're talking about?
Sure. So, we associate the mind with the brain. There's a question in some people's mind whether there might not be something immaterial about the mind. But from a scientific point of view, we can't study that. And so we really focus on the brain and feel that by understanding the brain, we can understand the mind. And it's been a very fruitful course of study. So brain is made up of billions of individual cells called neurons, and they're in constant communication with one another. And different areas of the brain are responsible for different functions. And so at the brain stem, that's where the brain connects to the spinal cord, we have very primitive functions, such as regulating breathing and heart rate. As we go up, we get to emotional centers, centers that are used for physical coordination, which is an enormously complicated processing task, by the way. In order to move your arm to scratch your head, your brain needs to coordinate literally millions of individual muscle fibers. It's a task that consciously we would be absolutely incapable of doing. But these parts of the brain that we label quote unquote primitive are able to do these amazingly complex calculations. We go farther, we come to the frontal lobes, the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that's right behind the forehead. That is the most recent evolutionary development in humans. Prefrontal cortex is larger in humans than any other animals. And this is the part of the brain that gives us the ability to use logic, to abstract, to use rationality. So, we can broadly divide the brain into two parts. Parts of it that we can control directly, and psychologists call that the conscious mind. We're aware of that. And parts of the brain that are outside of our direct conscious control. Uh, for example, our emotions. We don't directly control those. Intuitions, things of that nature. Those are the uncontrolled part of the brain, which psychologists call the unconscious.
What a primer. That was perfect. Now, when you talk about the unconscious, how does that affect how we behave and act? I mean, there's a whole part of ourselves that we're not conscious of.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
talk a little bit about that.
I feel like the unconscious is responsible for some of the most important things in our life. Let's take something very simple, desire. All right. Desire really maps out the roadmap of our lives. It's the basis for all of the decisions that we make. At one point, I decided that I wanted to be a doctor. And for the next 8 years of my life, I pursued that goal pretty much to the exclusion of almost everything else.
Mm.
But where did that desire come from? Was it something that I decided I would have? Absolutely not. That came from my unconscious. The same is true of things like intuition or inspiration. Some of the most important scientific discoveries ever done were a result of inspiration. Our moods, our emotions, whether we're happy or sad. We think, oh, if I buy this new big screen TV, I'm going to be happy. Well, if you think about it, that's simply not true. We may buy things that give us momentary satisfaction, but genuine happiness is outside of our control. One more example, interpersonal intimacy. You can plan to go out with your friend or your loved one or something like that because you want to have a wonderful time together, and you can decide what you're going to do, go to the park, go to a restaurant, go to a movie, but you have no control over whether there's going to be that emotional connection. That's your unconscious mind. So we might say the conscious mind proposes, the unconscious disposes.
Wow.
We try to set things up to work things out the way we want them to, but ultimately, for most of the important things in life, we don't have control over it.
We hear a lot about childhood experience or that it's programmed, or, how much of it is innate and coming from somewhere else, like universe, right? And how much of it is our experiences with, childhood, et cetera, because all of those influences obviously would impact that as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, the psychology of the unconscious was really developed by two pioneers, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. I happen to believe that Jung's view is far richer than Freud's, and far more useful and interesting. Jung divides the unconscious mind into two parts, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Freud never got past the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious are things that have happened to us that we experienced consciously, but are no longer conscious. They kind of got pushed away. So these are things that happen to us in our childhood and also experiences that are difficult for us to manage. And so we push them away because we don't want to deal with them. So the personal unconscious contains things like early childhood experiences. It can be trauma. It can be wonderful experiences we had with our parents or other caretakers. Beyond that is something that I think is far more interesting, and that is the collective unconscious. That's the aspect of the unconscious that all humans have in common. Jung said, we all share a common physiology. Everybody has two hands, two legs, one liver, two lungs, one heart, etc. He said the same is true of our psychology. And there's evidence for this based on the fact that if you look at different cultures that had no contact with one another, and you look at the most important stories in their cultures, typically their mythology, there are themes that are repeated over and over again across cultures. And Jung believes that these are reflections of that collective unconscious. They're characters like the wise old man, the trickster, the wise old woman, the lover, the hero. There are also situations like the journey, the quest, rags to riches, things of that nature. So we see these themes over and over again, and that led Jung to say, you know what? These came about by evolution, and they essentially represent human instinct.
As you're talking, one of the things that I'm thinking is I have a client who's a leader in an organization, who's a founder, et cetera. And he says, I get these downloads. I get downloads, in the middle of the night with ideas of what I'm supposed to do. Right. And so that would be an example, I would assume, of somewhere tapping into something greater, right? Some collective and unconscious. I mean, is that, would you say that that's part of the collective unconscious, tapping into that?
It could be the collective or the personal, depending on the content. But I think it's really significant that these happen to him at night. The conscious mind often fights against the unconscious. A lot of stuff in the unconscious is quite alien. Some of it is quite scary. And so we tend to push it away. I don't think that's a great strategy because, as your client knows, there's treasure there. I mean, these downloads are probably not worthless. They're probably incredibly worthwhile, stuff that he'd be incapable of coming up with just by grinding away at the problem. And so the unconscious contents often appear when the conscious mind is suppressed a little bit. So when I was writing the book, I would keep a notebook next to my bed because oftentimes when I was in that sort of dreamy, mystical state between waking and sleeping, problems I was facing, how do I explain this? How do I connect this theme to that theme? It would just hit me in the middle of the night and I'd quickly write it down. So I think that if we want access to these riches, we need to pay attention to the things that come up when our mind relinquishes control and to have a means of capturing them, write them down, record a quick note on your cell phone, because oftentimes they're incredibly valuable. And because they come from the unconscious, we can lose them very quickly.
And how can that be used in the conscious world? If I tune into my unconscious, right? How does that help me as a human, as a leader, or to be better as a person?
The unconscious mind typically plays a compensatory role to the conscious mind. That is, it has a different viewpoint. Sometimes it's the direct opposite viewpoint of the conscious mind. But the advantage of that is that it will often come up with solutions that we were not able to come up with rationally. A lot of times you feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? If I do this, I'm screwed. If I do this, I'm screwed. And there's no third option. Well, in many cases, there is a third option, but the conscious logical mind just can't see it. And if you're going to get that third option, you're not going to be able to figure it out rationally. It's going to have to come from the unconscious. In many cases, I think that people can think of examples where they hit a dead end and it felt like that there was no place to go. And then boom, out of the blue, they're like, oh my God, it's so obvious. I'm do this. Why didn't I think of that before?
I hear so often, especially in a lot of the organizations I work in, rational, logical, structured organizations, corporations, institutions. When we start to talk about things like this, right, or somebody brings something up that is not rational, logical, structured, there sometimes is an aversion to that. It's like, that's touchy-feely, or that's that's not rational. Talk a little bit about that. What would you say to those people who are having that reaction?
I would say I can totally relate. I rely a lot upon my rational mind, and I consider myself to be a thinker. I'm not good with feelings. And so a lot of times it's very uncomfortable. And when I'm with somebody who's very, very good with feelings and is less oriented to thinking, I feel like it's hard for me to communicate with this person. And I even feel a little bit uncomfortable with them because I don't know what's going to come out of their mouth next. Embrace it. If something that is alien to your way of thinking makes you feel uncomfortable, that's a sign that it's an area where there's an enormous amount of benefit to be obtained because it's an area that you've neglected. It's a part of yourself that you've allowed to atrophy. And if you can tap into that part, it's going to support the rational, logical part of you in ways that you cannot comprehend. Rationality doesn't create anything. Analysis comes from the Greek word that means to take apart. So rationality can take what exists and it can take it apart in incredibly useful ways, but it can't produce anything new. It's only that touchy-feely part that's the fertile part of the brain.
As you're talking, a lot of this seems to rely on an intuitive sense. And what is your definition of intuition? And how do you think, I mean, how do you think we can access that? And also, can we trust it?
Yeah. So I think that one way to understand intuition is to compare it to sensory experiences. When we see, hear, or taste or touch something, we're simply being presented with data. And then we take that data and we make sense of it. It's data about the external world. Intuition is very, very similar. It's simply raw data. But instead of being data that comes from the outside world, it comes from inside. Now, some people are better with intuition than others. Intuition is something that I'm very, very comfortable with. And so whenever I make a rational decision, I ask myself, does this feel right? Does this have the ring of truth to it? And my intuition will answer me very readily. And I guess that's a compensation for me being so uncomfortable with feelings. You know, we all have different things we're good at. Thinking and intuition is what I'm good at. Perceiving and feeling are what I'm very weak about. So I love intuition. It's incredibly valuable to me. I trust it a lot. And, it will tell me if an idea I have is good or not. I will just feel whether it's good or not. Can we trust it? I would say, I would again compare it to our senses. Can you trust your senses? I think the answer is most of the time, but not always. There are illusions. Sometimes we think we see something and we didn't. We say, "What's that funny smell?" And it's not a funny smell. So we need to approach it with a little bit of skepticism, but I think in general, it's a good tool and we should learn how to use it.
So as you talk, I'm thinking, well, so I too have a bent towards intuition. I'm thinking, so how have you been able to integrate the feeling part?
Yeah, I've not been able to do it. I remember in college, I had a girlfriend who said, "You are totally not in touch with your feelings." And I didn't believe her at the time because I felt things very, very strongly. But that's just because I couldn't process them. They would just hit me raw and there was nothing I could do with them. So I sort of devalued them. And, when I was studying philosophy, a lot of philosophers, especially the early ones, also devalue feelings. They say you can't trust feelings. You got to look for rationality. And I embraced that. I for a long time, I lived my life that way. And then, as I read more and more Jung, I realized, no, this is not a good way to go. And so I've tried not to run away from my feelings as much. But it's very, very difficult. It's like exercising muscles that are weak. You don't want to do it, and you got to force yourself to do it.
And what's the benefit? Why? Why is there a benefit to doing that? And from your perspective?
Yeah. So we don't have any control over the things that are unconscious, but we do have control over the things that are conscious. And so for both Jung and Freud, they said one of the most important things we do in life is making the unconscious conscious. Since my feelings are largely unconscious, I'm at their mercy. And I get overwhelmed by them sometimes. And sometimes I simply can't function, or I'm in a situation where I need to use my feelings to figure out what the heck is going on, and I can't. And I end up functioning on a very, very primitive level. I'm in a networking event, and I'm just sitting there by myself, sipping my drink, having no idea what to do. And the thought of going up to a stranger, introducing myself, is absolutely terrifying. And making small talk. People are good with feelings. They make small talk without even thinking about it. And it's fun and it's fulfilling. I try and make small talk. It's awkward, uncomfortable, and boring. So I
Or
feel
that's
like,
the story you tell yourself.
yeah,
Right?
that's right.
I mean, no, I'm just saying, right? So we
It
tell
might not be
ourselves.
true. That's how I feel. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm just holding up the mirror there. Right. Yeah.
So if I take it, if I do the hard work, if I accept the pain, the feelings of inferiority, and try to come to grips to some extent with this, I think it will help me be a more well-rounded person.
Yeah. And I think there's a lesson there in what you're describing on your personal journey that's helpful to people listening, because I think a lot of people will relate to what you're saying about that. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, so there's a couple things in the book that I wanted to point out that I just want to ask you about. You talk a lot about magic. All right. What's magic? And why is that important? And why
Yeah.
should we want magic in our lives?
Yeah. What is magic? So it's not pulling a rabbit out of a hat. That's a trick,
Thank
right?
you.
Yeah.
That's a good
Uh,
distinction, actually.
yeah. I'm not talking about stage magic.
Yeah.
Um, I'm talking about quote unquote real magic. And I put it into quotes because it may or may not exist. I guess there's a good chance it does not. But our brains evolved to see the world in a magical way. And that's why we have supernatural stories in every single culture, bar none. It's because our brains are wired that way and we have no control over it. You don't want to fight the wiring of your brain. That's not a recipe for a happy, fulfilling, successful life. And so in this day and age of science, when we say, look, there's absolutely no proof that real magic exists, it's tempting to say, yep, that's right. Magic is simply a fiction. Yes, it is. But you know what else is a fiction? Matter. Matter's a fiction, right? You know anything about quantum mechanics, you
Right.
know that the world that we see that we think is real is not real at all. But we treat it as if it were because that's the most effective, efficient way to live our life. Oddly enough, accepting magic is also the most effective, efficient way to live our lives, even though it may not be true. Our brains are wired to experience tables as solid, even though they're not. So we go through our life accepting tables as solid because that's the most effective thing to do. The same is true of magic. All right, what is magic? Magic is when the natural world, and when I say natural world, I'm talking about the scientific world, bosons, fermions, subatomic particles, that's the natural world, is invaded by the supernatural. These can be gods, goddesses, demons, and spirits. We don't think much about these things rationally these days, but if you look at the stories that we tell, the books that are the best sellers, the movies that are the highest grossing, they've all got supernatural components in them because we have this need for the supernatural. We have a hunger for it. And we shouldn't deny it. We should feed that hunger and we should become sophisticated at understanding what it means to understand the world in a supernatural way. Doing that will allow us to have a better relationship with our unconscious, which expresses itself in supernatural ways and understands in supernatural ways.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all the movies and the things that touch people across cultures, and you're right. I mean, it really,
Yeah.
they all have similar themes, right?
Harry Potter, the
Yeah.
Marvel universe,
I mean, you can go on and on.
vampires,
Right.
zombies, all the
Right.
stuff. That's what people want.
Yeah, and is that wishful thinking? Is that survival, or we just don't know what it, I mean, or
I
should
think
we?
it's instinct. I,
Yeah.
I think we are instinctually drawn to these things. Um, And the more that we reject it in our conscious life, the stronger the pull is. And in some ways we lose control over it. And sometimes it takes people to very, very dark places. I think that by accepting it, embracing it, and trying to integrate it with our conscious understanding, looking at it, thinking about it, reflecting rationally on irrational things, I think is the healthiest thing we can do.
Yeah. And what's coming to my mind as you talk about this, because obviously, I have a very strong interest in this whole area. I think what's coming to my mind is also an openness, right? I mean, an acceptance of, okay, yeah, so it doesn't mean you have to quote believe something, because I think we get stuck in the belief part of it. It's also just being open and accepting to wonder. There's a sense of
Yes.
wonder.
Yeah, there's that famous Shakespeare quote. There's more in the world, dear Horatio, than is accounted for in your philosophy.
There you go. Yeah.
We kind of feel like sometimes we got everything figured out. And of course, that's nonsense. We only know a tiny bit of the world's knowledge. And by cutting ourselves off from the things that we don't currently understand, we impoverish ourselves. And so, yeah, we've got to keep an open mind. And not only to the world of knowledge, but also to the world of feeling, the world of story, the world of mythology. We tend to push these away. The word myth basically means a lie these days. It's incredibly devalued, but there is an enormous amount of value in these things if we
And
understand
wisdom.
them.
And a
Yeah,
lot of wisdom about human nature, actually, right?
that's right.
Um, okay. Just shift gears a minute, because there's one other part that I wanted to make sure that we captured today, and it's this concept of the shadow. As you talk about the unconscious, and you talk about the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, and there's a piece of ourselves that's unconscious and something that's collective that we all experience. How does this concept of the shadow fit in? You talk about it a little. I know Jung talks about it, but if you can describe it in your words and why it's important.
The shadow is part of the personal unconscious, and it consists of the very worst parts of us that we have rejected. So, for me, for example, it's very important for me to think of myself as a kind, gentle, compassionate person. And so my sadism is in my shadow. Um, Sadism is a scary word, but it's a normal human urge. We are all sadists on some level. And let me give you an example of that. You go to see an action movie. What happens to the bad guy at the end? Well, let's imagine at the end of the movie, the bad guy gets arrested and gets sentenced to prison for a few years. Well, this is so totally unsatisfying. We need the bad guy to be crushed, right? We want to see all of his work, all of his dreams crushed into the dust and watch him die a torturous death. Right? There's this word Schadenfreude. It means pain joy, taking joy in other people's suffering. If you pick up a newspaper, I suppose these days, just go to any news site on the internet. It is full of articles celebrating Schadenfreude. This person I don't agree with just got embarrassed, right? This person just went to jail. This person just lost their fortune. If they're people that we label as morally bad, it gives us great joy to see them suffer. And that's a form of normal sadism. So if we can accept that, if we can accept the things in our shadow, we can have control over them. So if I accept that I have sadistic impulses, I'm watching out for them. And when they come up, I'm aware of them and I can choose whether or not to act on them. 99% of the time, I'm not going to act on them. But maybe there are times when I use my rationality and say, you know what, in this situation, it's in everybody's best interest for me to inflict some punishment on this person. And I'm not going to pretend I don't enjoy it because they really pissed me off,
Right.
right? So if the shadow is unconscious, it will have a very negative effect on our lives because it's just going to burst out, right? We've all had the experience of something coming out of our mouth, incredibly hurtful, that we did not plan to say. We're like, oh my God, where did that come from? That is so unlike me. Well, no, it's
It is
not.
like you,
It's
right?
unlike your conscious mind,
Right,
but that's part of who you are.
right.
Um, and
And that's a
so
tough one. I think it's
it's a
tough,
tough one.
right?
Yeah,
It's really tough for all of us to accept that because we like to make ourselves in an image that it feels good to us, right?
yeah,
And I see this work, right? I see it constantly in, well, obviously we all see it in ourselves, but also with leaders, right, that I work with is accepting these pieces is very hard.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and making the conscious choice then. But once you accept it, what you're saying is then that's the beginning of being able to make the conscious choice.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Now, one of the sad things is that the personal unconscious is closer to consciousness than the collective unconscious, because the personal unconscious contains things that were once conscious. And so if we decide that we do want to be a whole, complete person, and we are going to start to pay attention to the unconscious, as we make that journey, the shadow is the first thing that we come to. And so in the beginning, it's a terrible, unpleasant, frightening journey when we encounter this ugly, ugly part of ourselves. So just a heads up, when you go into the unconscious, the first thing you're going to see is the ugliest part of who you are. But if you persevere, it'll get better. And if I could just refer to a fairy tale that everyone is familiar with, the Frog Prince, right? The frog dives down into the well to retrieve the golden ball that the princess has retrieved, and in return, it wants to be her friend. And in the beginning, all the princess can see is how ugly this thing is. Later, it turns into a prince and metaphorically completing her. You know, in fairy tales, when the lovers come together, that's a metaphor for a whole person. So it started out as this ugly, contemptible toad, and it turned out to be the thing she needed to make her whole. And that's how the unconscious is. When we first encounter it, it's not going to look pretty. We need to be prepared for that.
And Beauty and the Beast, right? I mean, that's a
Yeah,
similar
dude. Yeah,
one. And
yeah.
and then the other thing I'm thinking about is Luke Skywalker in Star Wars.
Mhm.
Where Darth Vader is his father, right? So I mean,
That's right.
all of these themes are similar to what you're talking about. It's
Yeah,
just
Darth Vader is the personification of his shadow. Initially, what he wants to do is destroy it.
right.
But then as the trilogy progresses and he grows, he realizes, no, this is an essential part of who he is, and his job is not to destroy it, it's to come to terms with it.
Right. What advice would you give to people listening if they wanted to bring more magic into their lives?
So magic comes from the unconscious,
Mhm.
and the unconscious represents hidden autonomous forces in our lives. They're hidden because we can't see them. They're unconscious. They're autonomous because we can't control them. And they are forces because they are powerful. So I think that we live our lives with this fiction that we control what goes on inside of our heads. As we get older, it's easier for us to accept that we don't control our bodies completely, right? But we like to think that we control the things that we think about. You know, maybe I'll think about what I'm going to make for dinner after this. And then later, maybe I'll think about a project I have to work on at work. It feels like I have that control. If you pay attention, you realize you do not, that thoughts come unbidden. Ideas often have a life of their own. And so I think that you want to bring more magic into your life, you have to make friends with your unconscious. You have to make your unconscious an ally. And the first step in making friends is understanding the other person. And the best way to understand another person is to simply listen to what they have to say. That sounds so simple, But
Oh,
listening is incredibly difficult. When somebody's talking to us, most of the time, we're not listening. We're thinking about what we're going to say, or our minds are wandering, thinking about that important meeting we've got later today. Listening is incredibly difficult, and listening to your unconscious is even more difficult than another person, because in the beginning, it's the ugly toad that you want nothing to do with. So you want to bring more magic into your life. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pleasant in the beginning. And we know this from fairy tales. Finding the treasure, living happily ever after, it involves a lot of suffering, a lot of sacrifice, and a lot of hard work. Start by paying attention to these autonomous things, ideas that pop up spontaneously, feelings that you are surprised about, and just try to be a little bit more awake to what's going on inside you.
I love it. Very, very sage words there. So you've given us so much here. I mean, a primer, you've given us all this wisdom. What would be some parting words of wisdom you would give us or leave us with, or a quote or words of inspiration that you think is relevant?
You know, we all work hard for the ultimate goal of being happy. But I think that in many cases, we don't really pay attention to what it is that's actually making us happy. We set goals for ourselves, and we pursue those goals, whether or not they bring actual happiness. You know, I'm sure a lot of your clients are pursuing money, and money can make you happy, but not always. And once you reach a certain point, it's really about points on the board. It's no longer about buying stuff you want or need. It's just having more and more and more. And that really doesn't lead to happiness. Different things lead to happiness for different people. And I would say, if you want to be happy, it's not obvious what's going to do it. You really need to pay attention, and you may need to make some course corrections. You may decide, you know what, I've devoted the past 2 decades of my life to building this business, but I have the most fun hanging out with my grandkids, or playing golf, or doing watercolors, or reading biographies. And think about what it would mean to maybe shift a little bit to doing things that make you happy. Think about what you're motivated by. A lot of people are motivated by sticks, not carrots. I know I'm incredibly motivated by guilt, and that's not all that healthy. A lot of times it makes me do the right thing, but at other times it makes me do things that I probably shouldn't be doing. I'm just doing it because I think I ought to, when really I don't. So pay attention to what makes you happy, pay attention to your motivations, and try to bring them into alignment.
Thank you so much for being here today. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I know it will have an incredible impact on the people listening. I will also make sure that we have a link to the book. So I'm sure people will want to read more about what you have to say about the unconscious and all of the things that you write about. But it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me, Janet. I really enjoyed it.